Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of A Poet Reads to Write. Today I would like to take part in a wonderful BookTube tag that was created by that wonderfully generous and insightful Pat at Book Chat with Pat. This is that wonderful BookTube tag called the BookTuber Community Joy and Gratitude. I think only Pat could have come up with such a wonderful, inclusive and welcoming BookTube tag. So this is it, Joy and Gratitude. The first prompt, this is a tag that is divided into 5 prompts. The first prompt is under the umbrella of that wonderful word, joy. For me, you're going to wonder where I'm going with this. For me, joy in many ways is found in the arts. And in particular for me, it's found in acoustic music and of course, books. In particular for me, my great, real obsessions that I keep returning to, things like poetry, fantasy, ancient Greek theatre, and philosophy more widely, particularly around such obsessions as consciousness and free will. But much of my own joy is found in acoustic music and in books. And for me, I love American bluegrass music very much. That wonderful, almost a take on the traditional string quartet. I love American bluegrass music. Such groups as Punch Brothers. Oh boy, I've never experienced such joy as with the Punch Brothers. I remember once going to a concert in Melbourne by the Punch Brothers a few years ago when they visited Melbourne, and oh my goodness, one of the highlights of my life. But with acoustic music as well as American bluegrass, I love opera to some extent. I'm trying to tune my ear to opera, but I am addicted to the traditional string quartet, chamber music, and to great symphonic music. I just love it. And I am particularly drawn to 20th century minimalism. Philip Glass, I just love it. Things like Zimmer and Richter. Philip Glass in particular I really love. But another 20th century minimalist composer who I've really tuned my ear to and really just moves me very deeply is the Polish composer Henryk Gorecki. I just love his work. I love everything Gorecki's done, but in particular his 3rd symphony, the so-called Symphony of Sorrowful Songs. It is such a profound, it's a great symphony in 3 large elegiac movements, and it is a symphony that is a real reflection, a meditation on motherhood in particular, on war, bereavement, the shocking costs of war, and the bereavement of a mother for lost husbands and sons. There is a lot of gender in the whole way Gorecki has composed the whole thing. But it is an incredibly moving symphonic meditation on bereavement and loss. It really just moves me so much. By the end of it, I try and listen to this symphony, or at least every month or two. I just turn everything off in my home. I just put the symphony on and just listen to it. And more often than not, by the end of the symphony, I am in tears. But those tears are not just for loss and bereavement. You know, the reminder of my own PTSD and troubled experience with bereavement, with the loss of my two brothers. But the tears that I experience are also for the transformative power of the arts. The way that the arts, you know, people like Henryk Gorecki can transcend such fraught subject matter and infuse it with such meaning and a type of transcendent joy. You know, the fact that, you know, we can't take away the angst, we can't take away the bereavement. You know, once we've lost someone, that loss is forever. But the arts can give us such moments for doing something with that bereavement, for, you know, living with those feelings, being able to speak the poison, the loss out loud, and to somehow change our headspace so that, yes, we are not, you know, we don't lose our bereavement, we don't lose that angst, it's there with us always, but we can do something creative, maybe even positive with it. Henryk Gorecki, oh, I just absolutely love that third symphony, the Symphony of Sorrowful Songs. It brings me undone. I just love it. And for me, the performance that I always return to, for me, is the performance by the London Symphony, conducted by David Zinman with Dawn Upshaw as soprano. You know, the way that symphony builds up layer upon layer, that textured construction of the symphony, the way it builds slowly with those harmonic chords, the repetition, because it is a very minimalist piece, and the way it builds and we get the climax with Dawn Upshaw, that soaring supplication of her voice. It takes us to such transcendence as we live for a moment with that, if you like, PTSD, that loss, the bereavement, the shocking cost of war. And of course, Henryk Gorecki, coming out of that mid-20th century European milieu, he knew PTSD, he knew loss, bereavement, the shocking effects of all of this sort of thing. So yes, for me, joy is never far from bereavement, and if you can somehow find some joy through the arts in bereavement, wow, transcendent. The second tag for this is friendship. Friendship. For me, the great philosophical meditation on friendship, the value of friendship, the way friendship can, again, help us transcend moments of great loss and psychic decline, if you like, even collapse, is the great Martin Buber, that wonderful German Jewish existentialist philosopher of what he called dialogics. You know, he created a whole philosophy from an existentialist phenomenological viewpoint, a phenomenological lens. He developed this whole philosophy around friendship and what friendship actually does for us. And Buber divided all relationships into I-it and I-thou relationships. And I-it relationships are where a subject, you know, because you are a subject to yourself, but the people or the animals that you relate to are simply objects. They only ever become an it or an object to you. And this is not a criticism, you know, it's simply a reflection on our time-poor nature of our reality. That, you know, most of our relationships with other people, with other animals, are simply transactional. And that's simply the time-poor nature of reality. It's not a criticism, that's just the way things are. But for Martin Buber, that probably reflects, you know, 90 to 95% of our interactions with the world. We relate to things as subject, I'm an I, but you are an it or an object to me. And then, of course, then Martin Buber had this idea of this other type of relationship, this really transcendent relationship, where we relate to one another deeply as subject and subject, I, thou. And Martin Buber had this whole meditation, this philosophy of dialogics, where he looked at these I, it, I, thou relationships. And for Martin Buber, if in friendship we can reach out to that other animal, to that other person, if we can reach out to them as a thou, as a fellow subject, and relate to one another deeply on that plane, if you like, of equality, Martin Buber thought that that was the sort of relationship that not only gave our life meaning and helped us to transcend, for Buber, such experiences as the Holocaust, as that shocking, heart-wrenching mid-20th century European experience. For Martin Buber, being able to reconnect, not only with the world, but with the animals and the people around us as I, thou. These were ways of dealing with such great angst and fraught subject matter. I love this book. This is a book, a short work of philosophy that I try to return to regularly to remind myself. And for me, of course, I have my relationship with Billy, and I love that such philosophers in Australia as Raimond Gaita, another fantastic Jewish philosopher, quite a conservative, traditional philosopher, I guess, an analytic philosopher in that English language tradition. But Raimond Gaita has done it in his own book called The Philosopher's Dog, and he has extended this Martin Buber idea of an I-thou deep relationship to not only being possible between equals as person and person, but also between a person and animals, particularly their companion animals. And I love thinking about Martin Buber through this lens of Raimond Gaita, and thinking about, of course, my own relationship with my Billy Blue. The idea that I can relate to Billy Blue as subject and subject on a plane of equality, and find that real transcendent beauty in that relationship, because I owe Billy so much. He has literally saved my life, and I want to relate to him as an I, thou, to really honor him and thank him for everything he's done for me. So Martin Buber, through the lens of Raimond Gaita, I can find this way of being completely in love with my hound. This hound that I am besotted by, that I owe so much to, my Billy Blue. The third prompt in this tag by Pat is laughter. I had to think very hard about this prompt, and I really for a long while couldn't think of any books that I read that were genuinely funny. Most books have light and shade, don't they? So, most books, even serious books like the books that I often read on the philosophy of death and the angst of bereavement and all these sort of things, most books have a light and shade in them. So there are moments that make you laugh or that are funny. But I don't often read anything that is particularly funny, wholly funny, in that comic tradition. It took me a long while to think of it. And eventually, of course, my mind went straight to Aristophanes, that great Athenian playwright. I love Aristophanes. I guess I am more drawn to ancient Athenian tragedy, particularly Aeschylus and Sophocles, although I quite like, I think, Euripides as well. I know Euripides gets a bad press, doesn't he, from the time post-Nietzsche. Nietzsche hated Euripides and thought he represented the whole death of a great ancient Greek tragic tradition. Boy. But a play like The Bacchae by Euripides, I think, is incredibly powerful. But yes, Aristophanes, the great comic writer, and the way he used comedy as satire on Athenian democracy, Athenian politicians, the rich and the famous, the wonderful, the way he set them up and made them watch his plays. It's quite astounding when you think of an afternoon at the theatre in Athens and, seeing all these rich and powerful, like Demosthenes and like Pericles, to see people like that actually come to the theatre and be set up by someone like Aristophanes. It's quite remarkable to think about, isn't it? But of course, you know, on our television, particularly in the English tradition, there is a grand tradition of that as well, isn't there? Through the lens of things like Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, which are not situational comedies at all. They're comedies where the comedy is very much in the verbal brilliance of the exchanges between all the characters. And in Australia, you know, riffing off Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, in Australia there's been this wonderful tradition with the Hollow Men and Utopia, which are the same sort of political satire set in contemporary Australia. In many ways, I think they're as good as their British origins in Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. But yes, for me, I guess, what I would return to time and time again for its comic value would be Aristophanes, that fantastic, classic Athenian comic writer. And recently, Paul Cartledge, this was a wonderful discovery for me. Paul Cartledge is an English classicist who was probably most famous for his historical work on ancient Sparta, ancient Thebes, and he's done a lot of work also on Alexander the Great and those relationships, especially between the Athenian city-states and the rise of Macedon under Philip and then Alexander. But a few years ago, he also wrote this tiny essay, this monograph, if you like, called Aristophanes and His Theatre of the Absurd. And Paul Cartledge has now also started to do quite a bit of work on ancient Greek drama, and in particular looking at Aristophanes. So yes, for me, the great comic writer in my own little library, Aristophanes. I don't unfortunately read a lot of stuff that is funny. I don't know why. I probably need a little more lightness in my mental headspace. The fourth prompt, community. Boy, one of my favourite novels of all time, you know, outside that body of work by Virginia Woolf. If I had to have a favourite novel outside Virginia Woolf, it would be Tim Winton, Cloudstreet. In Australia, Tim Winton was this wonder kid of Australian books and letters from the late 20th century right on. As a very young man, his first novel, Open Swimmer, won numerous prizes and catapulted him into the big time. And I still just adore Tim Winton. He's just recently done a new book, which I haven't read yet, I haven't bought yet. I'm going to have to save up my money for, a book called Juice. But this is the famous work by Tim Winton. In Australia, this novel is so beloved that it has been made into a TV teleseries. It's been rewritten and performed as a huge, epic stage play. So it's taken on many manifestations. You know, some people, of course, really react against this and don't like it at all. But for most Australian readers, this would be typically in the top 10 of just about everyone's list. Most Australian readers absolutely love this. It is set in Perth in Western Australia in the mid-20th century. And in many ways, it is, you know, Tim Winton looked around Perth. It was a city in the 1980s, 1990s, in that real era of, you know, corporate greed. Large parts of the city were being razed to the ground and rebuilt with, you know, glass and steel skyscrapers. So in many ways, this is an elegiac book celebrating that old Perth before it was knocked down by greed and rebuilt up. So in some ways, the community that this book is celebrating is a community that was in, or was at least in crisis, and it was being literally pulled down, pulled apart, and replaced. And Tim Winton wanted to celebrate it before it was gone forever. But it is also not only an architectural celebration, this is a remarkable celebration of people, in particular of two families who live in this large ramshackling house where they simply built a divider wall so to almost turn this large house into like a townhouse type situation. And on one side of the divide there were this large family of evangelical Protestant Christians completely lost in bereavement, in loss as a result of war. One of the sons had a near drowning incident, and when they resuscitated him, he came back with severe mental disability and handicap. And the book is a profound meditation on this family, on their relationship with each other, their relationship with God, the way their faith is sieged upon by bereavement and by the loss of so much with their poor son who they now have to live with and look after. Very, very powerful. And then, of course, on the other side, the flip side of this townhouse arrangement, there's another large family where dad is a drunkard, loses everything with the gambling. Mum probably a little bit is, on and off working as a prostitute. Certainly, is very promiscuous. It's a very different family to what's on the other side, the light and the shade. It's a thing that I, particularly with my own family background with mum and dad, very much come from. My maternal grandmother was a prostitute for most of her adult working life, and my dad came from a very naive, idealistic, Christian, Protestant, evangelical type home. So it's a type of novel with this light and shade on the two sides of this architectural divide that I really relate to. But the book just celebrates old Perth. It celebrates these people, these damaged, broken people who are trying to somehow make do, to somehow form connections with one another, with God, with the architecture that they live in. It's a remarkable book, and one of the great things for me, there's moments of magic realism in this, and there's a talking pig who finds such majesty, such transcendent joy in the gutter. This is a book for me that, again, like the sort of art that I'm often most drawn to, I suppose, it is art that often really brings me undone. Because I do have a history of PTSD and depression and anxiety, and I think being able to approach these sorts of subject matters, even though they're very fraught, but being able to approach them through the arts, and in arts that can give you moments of great transcendence. These are really, for me, great works of art that allow me to live with these things and to sit with these dark thoughts and to speak them out loud and to be with my Billy and to find some type of healing, some type of transcendent joy amidst all of this. So for me, yes, Community, I couldn't go past this remarkable book, Tim Winton, Cloudstreet. And something else I thought I might show you while we're doing Community. One of the things that I do every fortnight that I just absolutely love, which gives me my physical sense of community. Every fortnight I drive back to Mum and Dad's place in the lower Blue Mountains so Mum can stay home and look after my Billy Blue. And I go down to the blood bank where I donate my plasma. My blood type is AB positive. So I can only donate whole blood to 2% of the population. So there's not much call for my blood from the blood bank. But because I'm AB positive, while I can only donate whole blood to 2% of the people, my plasma is I'm a universal plasma donor. So everybody can have my plasma. And plasma is now used for many of the new medicines and also in the emergency casualty ward to treat people coming in with major trauma or with major burns and also trauma through surgery. Plasma is really important for that with bleeds and major bleeds and burns and all sorts of things. So I go to the blood bank every fortnight and donate 824 millilitres. Yes, that sounds a lot, doesn't it? And it does create a great bag at the end. But I donate 824 millilitres of my plasma. And plasma doesn't look anything like a blood product. It is literally golden yellow. You get this bag of golden liquid. And it is literally gold because it is now used in so many medicines and, as I said, in the casualty in the emergency ward to treat trauma and burns victims. So recently I've been to the blood bank and made my 100th donation of 824 millilitres of my plasma. And I got this certificate and the photo and these little pins to mark my journey to 100. So this is my celebration of me and my sense of community. I just feel fantastic going to the blood bank and donating my plasma. It makes me feel $1 million. They are so appreciative, and the sense of joy and wonder that, you know, yet again, you've come in to donate your plasma. It makes me feel fantastic. Just yesterday, actually, I was at Mum and Dad's for my most recent plasma donation, and that was donation 113. So I'm now on my journey to 200. We'll see how we go. But the wonderful blood bank in Australia makes me feel $1 million. All right, the fifth and final prompt, gratitude. Oh boy. I haven't done any poetry on this particular video, so it's time, isn't it? It's time we got to the poets. Gratitude. In Australia, a poet who's recently passed away, an absolute major international voice of contemporary English language poetry, was of course Les Murray. Les Murray was a very conservative man, I guess, so he has quite a fractious relationship with many critics, particularly academics within the Australian poetry community. But he's a poet who, I get that he did sometimes say things. I think he was a bit of a contrarian, and he did like to say things that sometimes caused offence, you know, rubbed political correctness the wrong way, those sorts of things. But he is a poet that I could not live without. About 2 decades ago, he wrote this verse novel called Fredy, Neptune, which is a verse novel again I just love. I love verse novels. I love that narrative sweep. Hence, I'm in the process at the moment, halfway through writing my own autobiographical verse novel to be called Hounded. And then a few years ago, before he passed away, he did this selection of verse on Bunyah. On Bunyah is this dairy farming town, very small town, right up in the north of New South Wales, way north of Sydney, about 6-hour drive north of Sydney. And Bunyah is the small dairy farming town where Les Murray grew up, because like so many Australian poets, he grew up on a dairy farm, and he collected a lot of poems together that were set in Bunyah, and he put them out in this beautiful volume called On Bunyah. It's a beautiful hardback book, as you can see. There's a photograph of the man. Wonderful, wonderful poet. But if you want gratitude, oh my goodness, here is gratitude. Les Murray, Spring Hail. Listen to this. Spring hail. This is for spring and hail, that you may remember, for a boy long ago and a pony that could fly. We had huddled together a long time in the shed, in the scent of vanished corn and wild bush birds. And then the hammering faltered, and the torn cobwebs ceased their quivering and hung still from the nested rafters. We became uneasy at the silence that grew about us and came out. The beaded violence had ceased. Fresh minted hills smoked, and the heavens swirled and blew away. The paddocks were endless again, and all around leaves lay beneath their trees, and cakes of moss. Sheep trotted and propped, and shook out ice from their wool. The hard blue highway that had carried us there fumed as we crossed it, and the hail I scooped from underfoot still bore the taste of sky, and hurt my teeth and crackled as we walked. This is for spring and hail, that you may remember a boy long ago and a pony that could fly. With the creak and a stop of a gate, we started to trespass. My pony bent his head and drank up grass, while I ate ice and wandered and ate ice. There was a peach tree growing wild by a bank, and under it and round, sweet dented fruit, weeping pale juice amongst the hail-shotten leaves. And this I picked up and ate, till I was filled. I sat on a log then, listening with my skin to the secret feast of the sun, to the long wet worms at work in the earth, and deeper down, the stones beneath the earth, uneasy that their sleep should be troubled by dreams of water soaking down. And I heard with my ears the creek on its bed of mould, moving and passing with a mothering sound. This is for spring and hail, that you may remember a boy long ago on a pony that could fly. My pony came up then and stood by me, waiting to be gone. The sky was now spotless from dome to earth, and balanced there on the cutting edge of mountains. It was time to leap to the saddle and go, a thunderbolt whirling sheep and saplings behind, and the rearing fence that we took at a bound, and the old abandoned shed forgotten behind, and the paddock forgotten behind. Time to shatter peace and lean into spring, as into a battering wind, and be rapidly gone. It was time, high time, the highest and only time, to stand in the stirrups and shout out, blind with wind, for the height and clatter of ridges to be topped, and the racing downward after through the lands of floating green and bridges and flickering trees. It was time, as never again it was time, to pull the bridle up, so the racketing hooves fell silent as we ascended from the hill, above the farms, far up to where the hail formed and hung weightless in the upper air, chattering, birdless, winds with silver roads for us to follow, and be utterly gone. This is for spring and hail, that you may remember a boy and a pony long ago who could fly. Oh, what a majestic poem of celebration and thanks. There are so many poems in this book that are real thankful, great poems of praise and celebration. Les Murray had, for my money, a wonderful ear for the celebratory, for the naive poem in praise of. I just love it. Yes, he was a very conservative person. He caused ripples, problems amongst the Australian academic and critical community in Australian poetry. But he was a majestic voice, a majestic writer, such an ear for the vernacular. I just love him. Les Murray. And while I'm talking about poets and the great poetry in gratitude, for me there's another poet, Dorothy Hewitt, passed away before Les Murray, so she would have been probably 10 or 20 years older than Murray. Dorothy Hewitt is sort of a mid-late 20th century poet. She grew up just south of Perth on a farm. I think it was a wheat farm down in the wheat belt south of Perth in Western Australia. But she very quickly left that and moved to Sydney, and she spent nearly her whole adult life in between the inner city suburb of King's Cross right in the middle of the the heart of the Sydney area, Sydney CBD, a great suburb, I suppose, of artistic endeavour, the great creative arts suburb. And then she also did much of her life in the upper Blue Mountains, where I am actually from, just west of Sydney. So she's a wonderful, wonderful poet who I just love. And she's written one poem in particular. It is one of my favourite poems of all time, along with something like Spring Hail by Les Murray. This is a poem that she's written in thanks of, acknowledging the debt that she owes her own ancestors on, back in Western Australia, south of Perth, in this wheat growing district. This is a poem she's written called Inheritance. It's a poem that is unpunctuated, so the line division does a lot of work in this poem. It's probably very reflective of that projectivist verse. So the line divisions are very important. I'll see how I go with reading it. This is another beautiful poem in praise of, politically, Dorothy Hewitt was at the complete opposite end of the spectrum to Les Murray, where Les Murray was quite reactionary, right-wing, conservative, although I love his voice. But he was a very conservative male voice. Dorothy Hewitt was very left-wing progressive, from the very hippie, alternative milieu, I guess. But this is a poem that goes back to her life growing up on a wheat farm south of Perth in Western Australia. Inheritance. Listen to this. I have travelled a long way from my origins. Is there anything left of the child with the wheaten hair who listened for owls, loved poetry and winter fires, remembered the strange moment in the dark fields, when the pet lambs, grown into ewes and wethers, trotted along the fence lines, bleating to be let in? You can never go back, only onwards, into the world, leaving behind all the loved things. The grandfather flying on his winged nag through the frosty paddocks. The handsome father haloed in sparks, roasting spuds in the ashes of the playroom fire. Where do you go from there, concealed in darkness? Glowing with the heat in the grass, the hawk in the wood, the plovers spinning of spring in front of the plough. To the old woman watching for her bulbs to come up, the irises lining the path, the white cockatoos in a flurry of wings, a visitation of angels. Oh, isn't that a majestic poem? A naive, idealistic poem in praise of, in thanks of those people who grew us up on their farm. I just love Dorothy Hewitt. Again, she's a voice very different to Les Murray, but she's a voice who I just love. I can't help but constantly be returning to. My poetry of gratitude, my poetry in thanks. It just makes you feel good to read that, doesn't it? Oh boy, the transcendent joy of the arts. As I said, this is a wonderful tag that was created by Pat at Book Chat with Pat, the BookTuber, Community Joy and Gratitude. And I am going to tag, I don't think any of these people were tagged by Pat herself, so I'm hoping these people maybe have not been tagged. So if you would like to, you might like to take part in this tag as well. I thought I might tag the wonderful David Novak from David Novak Reads Poetry. Such a fantastic website that or YouTube channel that not only deals with poetry but actually much more. The fine arts, a lot of novels, a lot of non-fiction work. David's channel is fantastic. Emily from the Linguist Library, who does really in-depth meditations on individual writers. She's just done a wonderful video on the Portuguese writer Pessoa, and she's done a lot of work, and she's got me reading Clarice Lispector. So Emily from the Linguist Library, another fantastic channel. You know, nobody does that in-depth reflection on an individual author the way Emily does. Meg from Books Off the Beaten Path, and Mark from Book Ramble, who just have such fantastic, joyful channel names. Charles Gregory from CG Rated Books. Now, Charles Gregory is just like Pat, actually. So wonderfully warm and welcoming, so inclusive. These are channels that I really love returning to. Oh, and a little bit like Emily from the Linguist Library, in the way that she does that in-depth reflection on an individual voice, is of course Eleanor from The Only Real Property. Another voice that is just a BookTube voice that is just fantastic. I've learnt so much about contemporary poetry, particularly conceptual poetry from Eleanor, stuff that I actually hadn't really been exposed to or read much of before discovering Eleanor's channel. And she's now doing a lot of reflections on prose poetry, which I'm also quite new to. So I'm learning a lot from Eleanor, and I just love her channel. Seanan from Sean and Shelf. Oh, Sean and Shelf, another great YouTube channel name, isn't it? Boy, it makes me hang a little bit with regret for my fairly prosaic BookTube channel name. But anyway, Sean and Shelf's another fantastic channel that very joyfully responds to and develops a thing on literature, particularly fantasy, which is a great genre that I just love and very drawn to. And then the great Albert from Albert the Conjugator. Oh my goodness, what another channel name. Oh, Albert. That's another channel that he has such a dry, quirky sense of humour. I love the way Albert just holds things together and the way he explores. He does a lot of, you know, thrillers, mystery, even horror type literature, which is very new to me. But it's a type of literature which I am trying to tune my ear to and maybe start an adventure in. We'll see how we go. So, this wonderful BookTube channel. Thank you, Pat, for this wonderful tag, and thank you for tagging me. I had a great time doing this. Hopefully you can just hear from my voice. I am feeling edified. I am feeling that my spirits have been uplifted by simply doing this video reflection on joy and gratitude. It's just lifted me up and made me feel wonderful. I know I'm going to have a wonderful day now with my Billy Blue as I load this video, and then hopefully the excitement tomorrow of watching the video and seeing how it goes on BookTube. So thank you, Pat. It's been a joy doing this tag. I love your channel. I love what you do. I love the way you are so warm and inclusive and welcoming. So thank you, and bye for now.